Imagine being a king. You command armies, control vast lands, and your word is law. But there's one enemy you can't conquer: your own body. In the medieval world, even for the most powerful rulers, life was a constant battle against disease, injury, and the terrifying unknown of their own biology. Forget modern medicine. The best care a medieval king could hope for involved consulting astrological charts and interpreting dreams. Treatments were brutal and often made things worse. Doctors might apply searing hot irons to the skin or prescribe poisons like mercury and arsenic. They brewed bizarre concoctions of animal parts and herbs, hoping for a miracle. There was no concept of sterile technique, no understanding of antibiotics. Surgery was a terrifying, butcherous affair, limited to the most superficial procedures. A simple cut could get infected and become a death sentence. A difficult childbirth almost always meant death for the mother, the child, or both. And chronic conditions we manage easily today became life-defining ordeals, transforming mighty rulers into living cautionary tales. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine suffering from constant, agonizing pain, with absolutely no hope of relief, all while you're supposed to maintain the facade of a divine, unshakable ruler. Imagine watching your own body betray you, swelling up, festering with sores, or racked by seizures, while everyone around you, your courtiers, your subjects, interprets every symptom as a sign of God's blessing or a terrible curse. The isolation must have been profound, the terror absolute. But because of their elevated status, their personal health crises became public spectacles with massive political consequences. We're going to explore the stories of three rulers whose bodies became battlegrounds and whose personal suffering reshaped the political landscape of medieval Europe. Our first story begins with Emperor Charles III of the Carolingian Empire, known to history as Charles the Fat. Instead, Charles became a tragic symbol of how physical decay could completely dismantle political power. Contemporary chroniclers paint a picture of a man whose body seemed to be at war with itself, expanding and failing in ways that his subjects found both horrifying and baffling. The condition that would define Charles's reign and ultimately destroy his empire appears to have been severe obesity, combined with what modern medical historians now suspect was epilepsy or a similar neurological disorder. Chroniclers like Notker, the stammerer, who wrote vivid, though possibly exaggerated, accounts, described Charles as a man of immense girth. His obesity wasn't just a matter of appearance. It was a debilitating condition that made any physical activity, including leading his armies, incredibly difficult. In an era where a king was expected to be a warrior, to ride at the head of his troops, Charles's inability to do so was a major political liability. His size was seen not as a sign of wealth and prosperity, but as a sign of sloth, gluttony, and weakness, a moral failing in the eyes of his people. Then there were the seizures. Accounts describe episodes where Charles would suddenly become unresponsive, his body convulsing. To medieval minds, this was deeply disturbing. Was it the falling sickness, a condition viewed with a mixture of fear and superstition? Was it a sign of demonic influence? Or was it, as some whispered, a punishment from God? Each seizure chipped away at his authority, making him appear unfit to rule. His court became a place of whispers and political maneuvering. His every illness was scrutinized. When he suffered from agonizing toothaches and head pains, he desperately sought relief. In one horrifying instance, in 887, his physicians, believing the pain was caused by evil spirits trapped in his skull, resorted to trepanation. They drilled holes into his head. This wasn't a sterile, modern neurosurgical procedure. It was a crude, agonizing operation performed without anesthetic, likely with unsterilized tools. The goal was to release the supposed pressure or demons. The result was probably a severe infection, increased pain, and further neurological damage. Instead of curing him, his doctors likely accelerated his decline. The political consequences were catastrophic. As Charles grew weaker, his grip on the vast Carolingian Empire slipped. Stripped of his titles, his power, and his dignity, Charles the Fat was forced into exile, sent to a monastery in Swabia, abandoned by all but a few loyal servants. The man who once ruled an empire died just a few weeks later. In January 888, his death marked the final, irreversible collapse of the Carolingian Empire, which shattered into a collection of smaller, competing kingdoms. The story of Charles the Fat is a stark reminder of the brutal intersection of health and power in the medieval world. His obesity and epilepsy were not just personal medical issues. They were political disasters. They were interpreted as signs of his unworthiness to rule, creating a crisis of legitimacy that his rivals were all too eager to exploit. His suffering, amplified by the barbaric medical treatments of his time, directly led to the disintegration of one of the most powerful empires Europe had ever known. But Charles was not the only monarch to face such a fate. Our next ruler's story involves a disease so feared, it was known as the living death, a disease that would turn a handsome and promising young king into a figure of both pity and terror, isolating him from his own family and his own people. Stay with us as we delve into the tragic reign of Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem. They say history is written by the victors, but what history often fails to record is the smell of rotting flesh beneath ermine robes, the screams echoing through palace corridors at midnight, or the sight of a king's body slowly consuming itself from within. Medieval royalty lived in a world where power and prestige could not protect them from the most brutal realities of human frailty. Behind the gilded portraits and romantic legends lies a grotesque truth. And casualties of a world that interpreted illness as divine punishment rather than biological crisis. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was an era of profound contradiction. While castles rose toward the heavens and cathedrals proclaimed human achievement, the human body remained a mystery wrapped in superstition and theological doctrine. Medicine was not yet a science, but a blend of ancient Greek humoral theory, religious mysticism, and folk remedies that often did more harm than good. For commoners, illness meant suffering in obscurity. Unlike modern leaders, who can retreat from public view during illness, medieval monarchs were expected to embody strength, divine right, and physical perfection. A king's health was interpreted as a reflection of God's favor upon the realm. When that body failed, when it swelled with edema, convulsed with seizures, or descended into madness, it created a crisis that extended far beyond the individual. Consider the Byzantine Empire in the 9th century, a realm that still commanded vast territories and maintained the remnants of Roman administrative sophistication. Medical practitioners, despite their access to Greek and Roman texts, operated with fundamental misunderstandings about anatomy, infection, and disease transmission. And when these treatments inevitably failed, the blame fell not on medical ignorance, but on the patient's moral failings, or God's inscrutable judgment. The palaces themselves, for all their grandeur, were breeding grounds for disease. Stone walls trapped moisture, creating perfect conditions for mold and respiratory ailments. Primitive sanitation meant that waste often accumulated in castle moats or poorly constructed cesspits that contaminated water supplies. Feasts featuring rich meats and limited vegetables created conditions for gout, obesity, and digestive disorders. The very symbols of royal privilege, the heavy robes, the sedentary lifestyle, the rich diet contributed to the physical deterioration of those who wore the crown. And when illness struck, the remedies available were often worse than the disease itself. Royal physicians, despite their elevated status, worked with tools and knowledge that would horrify modern medical professionals. They diagnosed by examining urine, color, its smell, and even its taste, believing it held the key to the body's internal state. Let us look at some of the most powerful rulers of the medieval world and the horrific maladies that brought them low. Take, for instance, King Alfred the Great of Wessex, celebrated as a brilliant military strategist and a unifier of England. Alfred suffered from a mysterious and agonizing illness for most of his adult life. Modern historians and medical experts have retroactively diagnosed him with what was likely Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition for which there was no effective treatment in the 9th century. Then there's the tragic case of Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. His reign began promisingly, but in his early 20s, he began to experience terrifying psychotic episodes. He refused to be bathed or change his clothes for months on end. His doctors were utterly bewildered. They tried everything from drilling holes in his skull to release bad air to performing exorcisms, believing he was possessed. Of course, none of it worked. Charles's madness created a power vacuum at the heart of the French court, leading to a brutal civil war between the factions of Armagnac and Burgundy, and ultimately allowing England's King Henry V to invade and nearly conquer France during the 100 Years' War. The mental collapse of one man directly led to the near collapse of an entire nation. Even the legendary William the Conqueror met a gruesome end. While campaigning in France, his horse reared suddenly, ramming the pommel of his saddle into his abdomen. The impact ruptured his intestines. In the days that followed, infection set in, and his body began to swell grotesquely. He died alone, and his body was stripped of its finery by looters. The funeral itself was a disaster. His bloated corpse was too large for the stone sarcophagus prepared for him. King Henry I of England is said to have died from a surfeit of lampreys, a type of eel-like fish. While likely an oversimplification, it points to a fatal bout of food poisoning, a common danger in an age without refrigeration. Emperor Frederick II, the so-called wonder of the world, a man of immense intellect and curiosity, likely died of dysentery, a simple intestinal infection that is easily treatable today. The lack of understanding about germs, nutrition, and mental health turned every illness into a potential death sentence, and every royal court into a high-stakes medical drama. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these fluids: too much blood, too much black bile, which was associated with melancholy. The patient might be prescribed purgatives to induce vomiting and diarrhea, further dehydrating and exhausting them. These grotesque realities were hidden behind a veneer of power and divine right. A king was supposed to be a reflection of God on earth, but in the end, his body was just as fragile, just as susceptible to pain, infection, and decay as that of his lowest subject. Their suffering reminds us that beneath the crowns and the chronicles, history is fundamentally a human story, a story of ambition and power, but also of vulnerability, pain, and the universal struggle against our own mortality. The next time you see a stately portrait of a medieval king, remember the unseen story, the agonizing pain, the creeping madness, and the putrid smell of a body betraying its master. It's a side of history that's far less glamorous, but infinitely more human. Thanks for watching, and if you found this glimpse into the darker side of royalty fascinating, be sure to like and subscribe for more.